All right, folks, today is the last day before the final shape launches, and there are a ton of changes coming in the final shape. So to prep you and make sure you know what's going on, we're going to show you everything that is going to be changing in the final shape as quickly as we can. The first thing we're going to cover is everything that's going to be leaving with the final shape. This is all bounties, missions, quests, engrams, seasonal heirlooms, and artifacts from the Season of Defiance, Season of the Deep, Season of the Witch, Season of the Wish, and now into the Light. In addition, all the ritual and pinnacle weapons and ornaments from the tower vendors are going to be gone, but all of that gear is going to be available in the Monument to Lost Lights exotic archive, which is in the middle of the vault in the tower. Of course, everybody's been talking about the fact that legendary shards are going to be gone and basically replaced by glimmer as the main currency in Destiny 2. In addition, the spec mods of Boss Spec, Taken Spec, Minor Spec, Major Spec, and Adept Big One Spec are going to be leaving. So basically all of these things, plus all of the previous 4 seasons, all of those materials, keys, offerings, currencies, all of that stuff is going away. In addition, all of the trophies of bravery from Into the Light are going to be leaving as well. So if you haven't gotten the brave weapons that way, you're gonna have to wait until Bungie shows us the next way that you can get some of those brave weapons. Also, this includes all the fishing materials from Season of the Deep. So if you were someone who is really into fishing in Destiny 2, your time is now at an end. Mementos are going to be changing in the final shape, and you'll now be able to have a stack of 3 in your inventory. They're one-time consumables, and once you have 3 of a certain type of memento, you can't get another one. One of the cool things though is that you don't have to visit the Enclave to put it on your weapons. You can just use it as a consumable one time and then unlock it for the weapon of your choice. Along with the previous seasons that are leaving, the exotic missions and quests from this past year are going to be going as well. That's going to include the Vexcalibur mission and the Wish Keeper mission, which is star-crossed. Those are not going to be available anymore, as well as the Wicked Implement Scout Rifle, which comes from the deep dives in Season of the Deep. Plus, there's also some seasonal cosmetic exotics like ships and sparrows, but we're not going to cover that in this video. The main thing is all of those exotics are now going to be found again in the exotic kiosk in the middle of your vault in the tower. Next up, let's talk about every ability change that is coming in Destiny 2. Supers now all have the same damage recharge base time, which basically means that if you're taking or giving damage in the game, every super is going to have the same damage recharge. So in the past, supers have had a different damage recharge time. So if you took or gave more damage and you had a tier 1 super, your super would charge faster than anyone else. This is especially huge in the Crucible, but now all supers have the same damage recharge time. The only thing that's different between the tiers is the passive recharge rate of the super. So if you have a tier 5 super, if you're passively not doing anything, it's going to take a long time versus a tier 1 super, which is not going to take as much time passively. But that giving and receiving damage is the main way that Bungie wants us to charge up our supers. Instead of reading every little patch note that's going to be coming, I'm going to be giving you the gist of all the ability changes so you know what's going on. If you have any specific questions about numbers, I'm going to leave a link to all of the documents down in the description box below. Stasis is getting a huge rework with the final shape, especially in conjunction with the Prismatic Subclasses. The major change that Stasis is going to get is the new Frost Armor. Instead of a generic overshield, sometimes when you were using Stasis, you're now fortified by layers of durable stasis matter, which reduces incoming damage, and also damage resistance will grow stronger as you get additional stacks. It's really going to be important in PvE as well. To allow everybody to get this frost armor really easily in a lot of different ways, they've changed the way that stasis shards work by creating a lot of different ways to streamline how you create those stasis shards. Another big thing is the addition of a different fragment called Whisper of Chill, where stasis weapon final blows have a chance to create a stasis shard. Many of the harvest aspects like Grim, Tectonic, or Glacial will now give you a small amount of health and give you a stack of frost armor. The basic idea is to give you a lot of different ways to chain all of your stasis abilities together as long as you're continuing to create stasis crystals and shards. A lot of the different whispers of the Stasis subclass have been reworked slightly to give you some different energy regeneration depending on what you're using. But there's a new stasis fragment called Whisper of Reversal, where if you are using frost armor and you have it, when you deal or receive a physical melee, your damage will actually slow your victim or your attacker. The last major change is that they're going to increase the base PvE shatter damage from 200 to 400. The theory with Stasis is that it's always been a crowd control kind of ability class, so they want to really lean into that with shattering crystals, freezing, and things like that. So if you've been sleeping on Stasis for a while, it may be a good time to hop back in and try it out with the final shape. Warlock Stasis subclass is actually really good in PvP if you know how to use it, but they've increased the number of seekers created by ice flare bows from 5 to 7, giving you a little extra buff. Hunters, they've given you a couple of PvE damage buffs in terms of using Stasis. For example, if you're using Winter's Shroud, if you slow a target, it will briefly increase your class ability regeneration rate. However, this is reduced in PvP, basically buffed up in PvE, and it gives you a damage reduction in PvE as well. They've changed grenades just a little bit, adding an additional stasis crystal to the ring formation if you're using glacial grenade with Touch of Winter, but instead of the glacial grenade instantly forming, it now forms in 0.27 seconds. I'm not sure if you're going to see a difference, but you might. If you're using Touch of Winter, cold snap grenades are no longer going to chain additionally. Instead, the seekers are going to now duplicate when they freeze a target and also create some different stasis crystals, which will help out with that frost armor. In addition, with Silence and Squall, which is the super, they're going to increase the Squall travel speed by 10%. But one of the things they're going to do so it doesn't overshoot targets is it's going to slow down when any target is within the area of effect. They're also going to increase the damage and the slow tick rate versus PvE combatants by about 40%, which will be a very nice PvE buff. Stasis Titans have often complained about their usage in PvE, and to combine all of the stuff with the combat of the Prismatic Titan, they're changing quite a few things about Stasis on Titan. For example, if you're using Shiver Strike, they've increased the damage versus PvE combatants by about 10% and increased the melee target search area cone by 50%. Basically, they want to make the melee fantasy of the Behemoth Titan to be really strong, and they're leaning into that. A lot of Titans didn't like using Chiroclasm because there was a sprint time requirement. However, they're going to be removing that. However, it will have a cooldown for 4 seconds, which is kind of similar to how you do the Shield Bash or the Hammer Strike. There'd be a slight use of your melee energy to deal with the movement speed. They're kind of doing the same thing here with Chiroclasm, where it has a small cooldown for a little period of time. The last thing about Stasis is that they're going to be buffing Diamond Lance, especially in PvE, basically making them on par with Strand Tangles. Of course, they're going to have more crystals be created to allow you to get more frost armor and increase the time, but that's the major change. Using Diamond Lance is going to be a little bit easier to use in PvE. It's going to be really crazy to use this with the Prismatic subclass, so I'm really excited to see what they do with that. Arc has been pretty strong, but it hasn't seen a real big focus, but they're not reworking it for the final shape, just a couple of adjustments. They're basically making Tempest Strike give you a little bit more damage resistance in PvE. They're also decreasing some cooldown times and also making it so Arc Staff will blind enemies when you're using the Palm Strike or the Heavy Air Slam, which is similar to what you do with the Warlock or the Titan. Speaking of Warlocks, with Lightning Surge, they're going to give you a little bit of damage resistance versus PvE combats when you're using it. Plus, Ball Lightning is going to basically be a little bit easier to use because they're increasing the arming shape size by 30%. Last thing for the Warlocks on Arc, they're going to increase the secondary chain's projectiles base damage a little bit for Chain Lightning to give it a little bit more oomph, especially when you're fighting with lots of mobs of enemies. For Titans on Arc, they're going to be buffing the Thunderclap melee, giving you a little bit of additional damage resistance versus PvE, but they've also increased some of the damage that you can get with that Thunderclap as well. With Knockout, they've done a couple of different changes. They've nerfed it in some ways and they've buffed it in some ways. One of the buffs is to increase the bonus damage granted to powered melee attacks. Versus PvE combatants, it's going to be doubled. However, the healing behavior is going to be a little bit different. It's instantly going to give you a chunk of healing that scales with the type of target defeated. So if you've killed an enemy that's a little bit bigger, say for example, like a major combatant, you'll get more health points back than you would, say for example, like a Dreg or a minor combatant. If you're worried about this going crazy in PvP, you don't have to worry about it. You only get a few points back in PvP. For those of you who are using those and crutching on the knockout aspect, when you're playing in PvP, you might have to do something different because you won't just instantly get all your health back. They've also given all arc grenades a slight buff in PvE. However, there's a couple of changes with Jolt and your tracking speed times. So make sure you check that out if you're really wanting to get specific about all the details with the arc grenades. Finally, there's going to be some slight PvE buffs to some of the arc fragments, Spark of Recharge, Spark of Beacons, and Spark of Frequency. Just check those out when you're using the arc subclasses and see if there's a slight difference in what you're using and see if that makes a difference, especially when you're using Prismatic with the arc. As we head into solar, everybody has already talked about it, but Well of Radiance is going to be changing significantly. Instead of giving you amazing survivability and amazing weapon damage, they're going to reduce the player's survivability while standing in the Well of Radiance aura. Basically, they're giving you restoration in that well instead of just making you invincible when you're standing there. In addition, it's going to give you 8 seconds of Radiant when you leave the Well of Radiance, and it'll also increase the maximum orbs of power from defeating targets while in the well from 4 to 5. For our hunter friends out there, they've changed the behavior of Lightwave Knife. Now it's going to have 2 melee charges by default, and they've increased its speed so you can use these really quickly, flick them really fast so that you can get lots of damage off. However, it's not going to stack with Ophidius Spathe. It's kind of similar to how you'd use your Strand melee on Warlock, except they're bringing it to Hunter instead. If you are one of those hunters that got your Godslayer seal through getting 5 other hunters, stacking Star Eater scales, and creating lots of orbs and just baking the bosses, that is no longer going to be a thing. They've reduced the strength of the orbs of power created on precision hits, so you won't be able to just chain kill bosses when you're going into the final shape. For our Titan friends, Consecration is going to get a huge buff. The slam attack is now going to be able to shatter stasis crystals, and they're really leaning into that specifically with the prismatic subclasses. They're buffing up the PvE damage by 20% and also making it easier to hit targets while using your consecration, especially to combatants that are floating. With Hammer of Soul, they're changing the way it works so that you don't have to use the sunspots with Soul Invictus. They changed a couple of pieces with the Hammer of Soul, so basically you can keep using that and also not have to lean into the sunspots, so that maybe you can use Consecration instead. Finally, they're going to be buffing up Swarm Grenade to do a little bit more damage, which is really nice because it's a homing grenade. However, it's very much lacked in comparison to the other solar grenades, so check that out when the final shape launches. Along with the changes of Well of Radiance, as we move into Void, we have to talk about Ward of Dawn. They've changed how it works significantly, meaning you have to build into it to make it work kind of like it did in the past. They've removed the Armor of Light overshield and just gives you a Void overshield. To get the benefits of Weapons of Light, you no longer get it by default. Someone in your fire team has to be wearing the Helm of Saint 14 instead. If PvP players have ever been annoyed by anything in Trials, it's probably a Ward of Dawn. They are changing that. Now the health of the players inside the Ward of Dawn in PvP is going to be significantly lower. You won't be able to buff that up by using Bastion barricades inside the ward to give you more overshields, so you won't be able to stack that together. So hopefully PvP players will be happy with this change and maybe lean into something else. However, the damage with PvE combatants will be about the same. So if you're sitting in a Ward of Dawn, you'll have about the same health that you would in other PvE activities in the past. However, if you like Void Titan and you want to lean into that, they've increased and buffed up a couple of other things, like for example, the shield throw. They're going to increase the damage versus PvE targets by 20%, and also basically just making it a lot easier to use by increasing the tracking shape size, also increasing the maximum bounce, and also the lifetime, basically meaning that that shield kind of has a life of its own once it's left your hand. There's a small change to offensive bulwark to make sure that you can have a good, consistent way of getting void overshields, and there's not going to be any issues like there was previously with the Ember of Empyrean on the solar subclass. So basically, they're just making a slight change there so you can get your void overshields consistently. For those people who you want to use Nova Bomb, whether it's Cataclysmic or Vortex, they're increasing some of the damage by increasing the seeker count for the Cataclysmic from 4 to 6. And for Vortex, they're making the Vortex last longer from 7 to 10 seconds. While Pocket Singularity is really good in PvP, in PvE it struggles a little bit, so they're increasing the detonation damage versus PvE combatants by about 50%. They're also buffing the Chaos Accelerant Charged Magnetic Grenade, especially in PvE. As we head up into Strand, which was the most powerful of the last year because of course it came in Lightfall, they're going to be making some slight differences. For example, the threat of warding, which would give you increased woven mail duration, they're now taking it from 10 seconds to 5 seconds because it was way too powerful in the past. In addition, ensnaring slam is going to be a little bit easier to read. Instead of it being a sphere, they're making a cylinder. So say, for example, you're in PvP and you're trying to play against a hunter trying to do that. It should make it a lot easier to read. However, it'll still be good in PvE. The melee for the hunter is going to be reduced versus enemy players, aka PvP, by just a little bit because it's just a little too strong. For warlocks, there's barely any changes, but basically for Weaver's Call, they're going to add a new behavior where if you defeat a target with strand damage, there's a chance to generate a purged thread lane. The most significant change to happen is definitely to the Titans, and most importantly to grapple tangles and melees. Long story short, you can't just infinitely grapple onto a grapple tangle, and instead you're going to have to recharge them. Basically, that means that if you're someone who's leaned on Worm God Caress and using that to absolutely annihilate bosses, you'll no longer be able to do that. And I know right now the Snazzy Rock is crying in a corner somewhere, but I'm sure that there will be some broken tech somewhere else with the prismatic subclasses. Last thing on the grapple melee discussion is grapple melee will no longer be able to be used after firing your weapon. They're doing that to change things because a lot of times in PvP, people would use grapple melees and hand cannon shots really quickly to instantly kill someone. So that was really, really hard to read, but also it deals with the whole 1-2 punch equation with melting bosses with the infinite melees. We all know that Banner of War is really strong for Strand Titans, so they're nerfing that just a little bit, basically reducing the maximum amount of time that you can have, plus the diminishing returns with Syntheseps and Worm God Caress. Next up is a massive change that PvE players have been asking for years, especially me, and that is the update to the HUD. Instead of just slamming all of your buffs on the left-hand side of your screen and calling it a day, now there's going to be different images, timers, and also placements for different parts of the stuff that is happening on screen. The weapon channel is going to be right above the super meter and kind of tucked in below any buffs or debuffs. On the left-hand side of the screen with the buffs and the debuffs, those are normally there anyway, but they're going to have a whole new set of symbols to show off the buffs and debuffs, which will make a lot more sense, and they're also sensitive to people who are colorblind. The most important thing is that they're going to be changing where the critical info is going to be, which is going to be the top center. Say, for example, if you're fighting Golgoroth and you have unstable light, that is going to be right front and center so that you can see your timer instead of having to drift off to the left-hand side of your screen. If it's not placed there, and if there's a different debuff timer, it'll be placed on the left side of the screen. So for all those people who are wondering, where'd your buff go? Where's the debuff? What's your timer? It's all going to be placed on screen in a clear and concise manner. All right, let's get into a big topic that everyone needs to know about, and that's everything that's changing with weapons. Because boss spec, taken spec, minor spec, major spec, and adept big one spec are going, they're going to be doing a massive increase in base PvE damage for a lot of weapons. There are a couple of exceptions to this, and there are a ton, so make sure that you check out the article listed in the description box below. But pulse rifles are getting a 20% buff, which is going to be huge. So if you're someone who's a pulse rifle user, make sure you slap on a couple of those in the final shape. Pellet shotguns are going to get a slight buff. Slug shotguns are getting a 9% buff. Fusion rifles are getting a 7% buff. Sniper rifles, 7%. Most importantly, not with Izanagi's honed edge shots or Cloud Strike. Glaive shots are going to get a 7% buff, and linear fusions are going to get a slight buff with 5%. Stacked onto that, there's going to be increased damage versus red bar enemies with certain weapon archetypes that stacks with the previous buffs that I talked about earlier. Sidearms, trace rifles, scout rifles, and bows are going to have a 20% buff. Auto rifles and pulse rifles an additional 15% buff. Submachine guns are going to get a 10% buff, and hand cannons a 5% buff. Trace rifles are going to get increased damage versus majors, also known as orange bars, and then machine guns and swords are going to get a slight buff of 7%, including in PvP. A couple of weapons that have gone a little bit above and beyond with their splash damage are Sunshot, Trinity Cool, Polaris Lance, and Graviton Lance. Their splash damage is going to be reduced by 10%. If you've been using a kinetic damage weapon, say for example a kinetic sniper, it's no longer going to receive any bonus damage to bosses because of the kinetic weapon buff. So if you've been using Supremacy as a quick, easy to use sniper for boss damage, you might want to look somewhere else. They're buffing a couple of aggressive hand cannons to kind of match Igneous Hammer like Criminal's Dagger and something new. Make sure to check the description for those specific numbers. Low inventory snipers are going to have a few more minimum reserves. And for those people using waveframe grenade launchers, they're going to reduce the length of the wave from 22 meters to 15 meters. In addition, the blast radius stat on waveframe grenade launchers is going to affect the width of the wave. So check out how you're using those waveframes when the final champ launches. Divinity has been toned down since it's been launched bit by bit by bit, and they're doing it one more time here by increasing the number of shots required to generate the precision damage gauge by 75% in PvE. While not a massive change, it might make it so you can't rocket swap or grenade launcher swap by using Divinity if you're the Divinity user. Osteostriga was very powerful for a long time, but now it has a 4-second cooldown on the poison burst on kills. They've changed the Necrochasm to have a little bit more damage in clearing different enemies. They've rebuilt the catalyst called One for Thrall, where when you damage 3 combatants in quick succession, it will provide a period of increased damage, range, and aim assist. They're also increasing the duration of the burn applied by the Cursed Thrall explosion from 2 to 3.5 seconds. For those of you loving Lament, 2 major changes coming. They're going to reduce the healing effect by 20%, meaning that there's going to be a little bit more risk when you use that sword. In addition, you're going to have to look for a new sword combo potentially for Lament. They've reduced the damage of the high end of the chained heavy attack by 20% while maintaining the 7% global buff to the sword. So I think the community will have to come together and find the best damage combo for Lament going forward. For those of you leaning into the Yeehaw fantasy, Dead Man's Tale will actually get a few buffs here coming in the final shape. Most of it is increasing some of the accuracy and magnetism fall off, but you just want to check it out and pull that out of your vault to see if it actually hits with you. Let's talk about a couple of other exotics that need a little bit of love. The Colony is getting a slight buff to help them deal with tougher combatants. Truth is now going to have increased area of effect damage and increase the reserves by 3. The Queensbreaker is now going to have increased damage versus bosses, mini-bosses, champions, and vehicles by 12% and increase the reserve ammunition by 3%. Cerberus +1 will actually have a cool focus fire perk, and instead of reducing the range or rate of fire, it's now going to activate on special reloads, but only following a kill. So kind of like Kill Clip for Cerberus 1. For those of you looking to punch things, Bastion is going to actually increase its damage combined with how things work with melees. They've made it so when you deal damage with your melee, it increases your charge rate, damage, and reload speed for Bastion. And if you land a majority of your pellets, it actually increases the melee damage. So sort of like 1-2 punch, but for a fusion rifle. Ariana's Vow is giving a slight buff where if you break a matched shield or you pierce a champion's barrier, it will cause that target to ignite. You also may want to pull out Deterministic Chaos. The weapon is now always going to have anti-barrier, but also every 4th bullet is going to make enemies volatile, and then every 16th is going to weaken them. So that's going to be a really interesting combination, especially when we go into the artifact and see the fact that there's going to be some void debuffs that are going to stack up nicely. A ton of the perks are getting a little bit min-maxed and adjusted just a little bit, 1% here, 2% there. So again, check out the document down in the description box below, but some major ones. Chill Clip is now going to change just a little bit on fusion rifles. Rapid fire fusions like Riptide are still going to require 3 shots to freeze, but if you have a slower one like Deliverance, it's only going to require 2. Chain reaction is too strong on special weapons, so they're going to be changing it, especially with wave frame grenade launchers. They're changing it so it's getting a slight nerf. On special weapons, it's 15% smaller area of effect and 20% less damage, and on heavy, it's the same area of effect as before, but 30% more damage. Now that we've gone through, talked about weapons, we got to talk about armor and everything that is changing with that. Let's kick it off with Hunters with Triton Vice. Basically, they're trying to make more people use glaives along with this exotic, and now you don't have to match your subclass to the glaive that you're using. It will always trigger a detonation whether it matches or not. Whether this is going to be viable and get more people to use glaives, only time will tell. I doubt it will. An exotic that every hunter needs to be re-looking at now is the Foe Tracer, because it grants the bonus damage it inflicts on a target to weapons. And with this change, it's going to allow Foe Tracer to buff multiple different weapon damage types instead of whatever matches your subclass or super element. This should be in everybody's back pocket if you are a hunter. Six Coyote is now going to allow you to create orbs of power from final blows after using your class ability. Renewal grasps are going to be updated with the new frost armor stasis keyword, which we talked about earlier in the video. When you enter the dusk field grenade that you've thrown, you and your allies gain a stack of frost armor, and about every second an additional stack of frost armor is going to be granted, and it's going to reset your frost armor timer, which is going to be really nice to have. Finally, to nerf all of those hunters just chaining golden guns together with Star Eater scales, they're going to reduce the amount of super energy gained per orb of power, and they're also going to make you have to get 6 stacks for the Star Eater scales instead of 4 to get the maximum benefit. Moving on to Titans, Ursa Furiosa is going to basically continue to work exactly how it has in the past, except it's going to improve the new Void aspect, Unbreakable, which will give you increased movement speed while guarding with Unbreakable. This might be really nice if you're using the new Void super as well, which could make you more survivable on the field when using that exotic. For those heathens using Eternal Warrior, you no longer need to have an Arc subclass for it. Basically, it will work with any of the subclasses, and that will work really well with Prismatic. Armamentarium is also going to make it so you can create orbs of power from grenade final blows. Capri's Horn, which was really good in PvP in some situations, was really not great in PvE, so they're buffing it significantly, increasing the damage from the Solar Blast by 100%, and also benefiting from Ember of Eruption and Ember of Ashes. Syntheseps, which has always been a staple of Titans, have now been nerfed slightly. When you are surrounded, usually you got a buff of 8 seconds for your bionic enhancements, but now it's going to be reduced to 5, and now you'll actually be able to see the timer on screen. Warlocks, we're moving on to you. If you're someone who's been using a build with Mantle of Battle Harmony, you're in luck because it is getting a slight buff, granting more super energy and also removing the cooldown. If you're someone who's been leaning into Stasis as a Warlock, you might want to take a look at Balador's Wrath Weavers. When you activate your Rift, it grants you and your nearby allies the maximum amount of Frost Armor stacks when you have the Frost Pulse equipped. When you activate your Winter's Wrath Shatter attack, it grants nearby allies the maximum amount of stacks of Frost Armor. So this could give you a lot of survivability if you're on a Stasis Warlock, and give your allies a lot of help as well. If you've been leaning on Sun Bracers quite a bit, unfortunately, that time has come. They've reduced the increased solar grenade duration from 4 seconds to 2 and reduced its grenade recharge rate to only allow a max of 4 grenades while the effect is active. For those people using multiple Warlocks with Cenotaph Mask, you basically want to only have one person on that now. They've reduced it, and now multiple players using Cenotaph Mask can no longer trigger its effect using a single enemy target. Now the Cenotaph's target lock visual marker is now hidden for the person wearing them. So just a few changes with that, especially if you're trying to generate heavy ammo on day 1 in the new raid. To help out with the build crafting, and something we've been clamoring for a while, exotic armor pieces are now going to have artifice upgrades. However, they're extremely expensive. You have to use an exotic cipher and 10,000 glimmer to work. For those of you slapping on ammo finders on your helmet, they've also tried to make it more predictable when you're using ammo finders in the game. It's been very bugged in the past and lots of issues, and honestly, I'm gonna wait and not hold my breath to see how things work out, because we may not get a buff with this, but they said that it's going to be more predictable as we move forward, especially if you're using ammo finders on your helmet. For those of you that get raid armor from the new day 1 raid, they're going to remove all the mod energy costs for raid specific armor mods, which is really nice and will help with your build crafting significantly. Another major change is how we get bounties and also things from ritual activities, and now they are changing it to the new Pathfinder node system. For those of you that played Star Fox, maybe this would look somewhat familiar to you and you'll know what I'm talking about, but for new people, basically there's going to be 20 objectives divided into 5 tiers. Basically, you just follow a path that you want to choose, following where you have different choices until you get to your big shiny loot at the end. If you've completed everything all together, you can reset your Pathfinder using Glimmer, but you'll get a new set of objectives to complete and new rewards to pursue. There's going to be 2 Pathfinder systems when the final shape launches. One is going to replace the bounty systems and all of the weekly challenges that we used to have for Vanguard, Gambit, and Crucible, so the core ritual activities. But there's going to be one specifically for when you're inside the Pale Heart as part of the expansions campaign. When you get your first 3 completions done, you'll get a Prime Engram, which will help you get your power level a little bit higher. However, after that, your next 7 will give you enhancement prisms, some bright dust, and XP. And after that, it will be enhancement cores, bright dust, and also some other XP as well. But the maximum amount you can get is on those first 3 completions of your Pathfinder. They're also updating the quests tab a little bit more, so it's a little bit more customizable, so you can choose which things you want to have in which columns and which ones you don't. Along with some new weapons, of course, always coming in a new expansion, there's going to be 2 unrevealed Trials weapons, 2 unrevealed Iron Banner weapons, and 2 unrevealed new Lightfall weapons coming as well. Here are a couple of weapons that are going to be moving out of rotation. From Trials of Osiris, the Resurgence Glaive, the Cataphract Heavy Grenade Launcher, the Messenger Pulse Rifle, and the Igneous Hammer Hand Cannon. From Nightfalls, the Braytech Osprey Rocket Launcher and the Loaded Question Fusion. And from Iron Banner, Yoram's Claw, Bite of the Fox, Pressurized Precision, and Swarm of the Raven. All of those weapons are going to be moving out of rotation, being replaced by other ones when the new expansion comes in. If you've already earned those weapons, you can just go focus them at their respective vendors, but the Adept versions are not going to be obtainable anymore. Finally, and the most important change, the thing that I'm most excited for, is the Prismatic Subclasses is going to be coming along with the new supers in the final shape. I'm going to be doing some breakdowns and best builds that you can have for those when it launches, so make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single thing. If you have any questions about anything, leave them down in the comment section below, or join the Discord and ask the questions there. If you need any help, come on over to the Twitch channel, twitch.tv/ManoDestra. Good hunting, Guardians. I'll see you next time in the universe of Destiny.